The gun was already drawn. The room already silent. And when Bumpy's enforcer stepped forward with that cold look in his eyes, everyone knew. Some lines, once crossed, end in echoes that never fade. There are moments in Harlem that don't announce themselves with gunfire. They start quiet. A word, a gesture, a smile that lasts 1 second too long. This was one of those moments. It happened at the Rhythm Club on a Tuesday night in 1958. The kind of night where the music was smooth, the drinks were cold, and everyone who mattered was there. Bumpy Johnson sat in his usual booth near the back, not because he needed to hide, but because kings don't sit where everyone else sits. He was talking with a few of his people. Business. Quiet business. The kind that kept Harlem running while the rest of the city pretended not to notice. And then the door opened. A man walked in. Young. Maybe 30. Dressed too well for someone who hadn't earned it. He had that look. The kind of confidence that comes from not yet understanding how the world actually works. His name was Vincent Cole. Vincent worked for a crew out of Brooklyn. Small-time operators trying to expand into Harlem. They'd been making noise for weeks. Talking loud. Pushing boundaries. Testing to see if Bumpy's reputation was real or just legend. Vincent walked straight through the club like he owned it. He didn't stop at the bar. Didn't nod to anyone. He walked directly to Bumpy's booth, stood at the edge of the table, and smiled. Not a friendly smile. A challenge. Bumpy Johnson, Vincent said, loud enough for half the room to hear. The king of Harlem. In the flesh. Bumpy didn't look up immediately. He finished what he was saying to the man beside him. Then, slowly, he raised his eyes. No expression. No anger. Just attention. You need something? Bumpy asked. His voice was calm. Almost polite. Vincent leaned forward, resting one hand on the table. I need you to understand something, he said. Times are changing. Harlem's changing. And your time? It's running out. The room didn't gasp. It went silent. The kind of silence that crawls into your chest and tightens around your lungs. Because everyone in that club knew what Vincent had just done. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't throw a punch. But he'd done something worse. He disrespected Bumpy Johnson in his own territory. In front of his people. In front of Harlem. Bumpy didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't stand. Didn't even blink. He just looked at Vincent for a long, quiet moment. Then he smiled. Not warmth. Just acknowledgement. You finished? Bumpy asked. Vincent straightened up, still grinning. Yeah, I'm finished. Good, Bumpy said. Then you should leave. Vincent laughed. Actually laughed. Then he turned and walked toward the door, shoulders back, head high, like he'd just won something. The door closed behind him. And for 5 full seconds, no one in the Rhythm Club moved. Then Bumpy turned his head slightly, just enough to catch the eye of the man standing near the wall behind him. A tall man. Broad shoulders. Dark suit. No jewelry. No flash. His name was Nathaniel Nate Cross. Bumpy didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Nate gave a single nod. Then he stepped away from the wall and walked toward the door. Still, no one in the room spoke. Because they all understood. Vincent Cole had just crossed a line that didn't exist on any map. A line drawn not in chalk or blood, but in respect. And in Harlem, respect wasn't a courtesy. It was currency. It was law. And when you violated it, you didn't get a warning. You got Nate Cross. Bumpy turned back to his conversation like nothing had happened. His voice remained calm. His drink untouched. His posture unchanged. But everyone in that room knew. The echo was already forming. It just hadn't made it sound yet. Nathaniel Cross wasn't born into violence. He didn't grow up dreaming of being feared. He grew up in Harlem, in a tenement on 139th Street, raised by a grandmother who worked 3 jobs and still found time to make him read every night. She believed in education, in dignity, in doing things the right way. And Nate listened. He finished high school. He stayed out of trouble. He even worked at a garage for 2 years, fixing cars, keeping his head down, trying to build something clean. But Harlem doesn't always let you choose your path. It was 1951 when everything changed. Nate's grandmother got sick. Cancer. The kind that spreads fast and doesn't care how good a person you are. The hospital bills came quicker than Nate could pay them. He worked double shifts, borrowed money, sold everything that wasn't nailed down. It wasn't enough. So he went to the only man in Harlem who could help. Bumpy Johnson. Nate didn't come begging. He came with a proposal. He'd work. Do whatever needed doing. Pay back every cent with interest. He just needed time. Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked one question. You ever hurt anyone? Nate shook his head. No, sir. Bumpy nodded. Good. Don't start unless I tell you to. Then he handed Nate an envelope. Enough to cover the hospital bills and 3 months of rent. You don't owe me money, Bumpy said. You owe me loyalty. Nate's grandmother lived another 6 months. Long enough to see her grandson one last time. Long enough to hold his hand and tell him she was proud. When she passed, Nate went back to Bumpy. I'm ready, he said. And Bumpy put him to work. Not as muscle. Not at first. Bumpy made Nate watch. Listen. Learn how power actually worked. He sent him to collect debts. Not with threats, but with presence. He had him stand in rooms during meetings, silent, observing how men negotiated, how they lied, how they broke. Nate learned that violence wasn't about anger. It was about certainty. And over the years, Nate became the embodiment of that certainty. He didn't carry a gun to feel powerful. He carried it because Bumpy trusted him to know exactly when, and when not, to use it. He didn't talk much. Didn't need to. When Nate Cross walked into a room, people felt it. Not because he was loud or aggressive, but because he radiated something deeper. Control. The kind of control that comes from a man who's made peace with what he's capable of. Bumpy had a dozen men who could throw punches. A dozen more who could pull triggers. But Nate was different. Nate understood restraint. He understood that the most dangerous men aren't the ones who explode. They're the ones who choose not to, right up until the moment they do. That's why Bumpy trusted him with the work that mattered. Not the public displays. Not the performances. The quiet corrections. The messages that needed to be delivered with precision, not chaos. And Nate never failed. There was a story people told in Harlem. Probably half true, probably half legend, but it stuck. A few years back, a dealer had been skimming from Bumpy's operations. Not much, just enough to think he could get away with it. Bumpy sent Nate to handle it. Nate found the dealer at a bar in the Bronx. Walked up to him, sat down, ordered a drink. Then he said, "You've been taking something that doesn't belong to you." The dealer tried to play dumb, tried to laugh it off. Nate didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just reached into his coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slid it across the table. It was a list. Every transaction, every dollar, every lie. The dealer's face went pale. "You've got 2 choices," Nate said, his voice calm as Sunday morning. "You pay it back by Friday, or I come back and we don't talk." The dealer paid it back by Thursday. No blood, no broken bones, just the cold certainty that Nate Cross didn't make threats. He made promises. That's who Bumpy sent after Vincent Cole. Not a killer looking for an excuse. A professional looking for a resolution. And as Nate stepped out of the rhythm club that Tuesday night, the air outside felt different. Colder. Sharper. He didn't rush. Didn't run. He walked. Because Nate Cross understood something most men never learn. Fear doesn't come from speed. It comes from inevitability. Vincent Cole had disrespected Bumpy Johnson in front of Harlem. And now, Harlem was watching to see what happened next. Nate pulled his coat tighter against the wind, slipped one hand into his pocket, and started walking south. He already knew where Vincent would be. Men like Vincent always run to the same place when they think they've won. Straight into their own mistake. News traveled fast in Harlem. Faster than cars. Faster than phones. It moved through barbershops and corner stores, through church steps and pool halls, carried on whispers that somehow always reached the right ears at the right time. By Wednesday morning, everyone knew. Vincent Cole had walked into the rhythm club. He'd stood at Bumpy Johnson's table. And he'd said the kind of words you don't take back. But that wasn't the story people were telling. The story was what happened after. How Bumpy didn't react. Didn't shout. Didn't stand. How he just looked at Nate Cross. And how Nate walked out the door. That's what had Harlem holding its breath. Because when Bumpy sent Nate, it wasn't a warning. It was a period at the end of a sentence. At Tony's barbershop on Lenox Avenue, 3 men sat waiting for cuts they weren't really there for. One of them, an older man named Earl, leaned back in the chair and shook his head. "Vincent don't know," Earl said quietly. "He think this like Brooklyn. Think he can talk big and walk away." The barber, Tony, didn't look up from the razor he was sharpening. "He'll know soon enough." "Should have known already," another man muttered. "You don't step to Bumpy like that. Not in his own spot." Earl nodded. "Nate's probably already found him." Tony paused. "Nate don't rush. He'll find him when the time's right." They all went quiet after that. Because that's what Harlem did when something like this was in motion. It waited. It watched. It respected the process. Across town, in a small diner on 125th, two women sat by the window with coffee they weren't drinking. One of them, Dorothy, worked nights at the Cotton Club. She'd seen Vincent walk out of the Rhythm Club the night before. He looked proud, she said, stirring sugar she didn't need. Like he'd done something. Her friend, Lucille, frowned. He did do something. He signed his name. Dorothy glanced out the window. You think Bumpy'll let it slide? Maybe just scare him. Lucille looked at her like she'd said something foolish. Bumpy don't scare people, Dorothy. He teaches them. And some lessons only come one way. Dorothy didn't respond. She just stared into her coffee, thinking about Vincent's face. That cocky grin. That swagger. She wondered if he still had it. Down at the docks, where the trucks came in early and the longshoremen started before the sun, a group of men stood smoking during their break. One of them, a man named Curtis, had a cousin who ran with Vincent's Brooklyn crew. My cousin says Vincent's laying low, Curtis said, flicking ash off his cigarette. Says he knows Bumpy's people are looking. Another man, older, with scars on his knuckles, shook his head. Laying low don't matter. Nate Cross ain't looking. He's waiting. Waiting for what? For Vincent to think he's safe. Curtis took a drag, looked out at the water. That's cold. The older man smiled, but there was no humor in it. That's Harlem. And that was the thing. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about order. Bumpy Johnson had built something in Harlem that went beyond money or territory. He'd built a system, a code, and that code only worked if everyone understood the rules. Rule number 1, respect is not optional. Rule number 2, disrespect has consequences. Rule number 3, those consequences are not negotiable. Vincent had violated rule number 1, and now Harlem was waiting to see rule number 3 enforced. But here's what made it different. No one was celebrating. No one was excited. They were solemn, because the people of Harlem understood something outsiders never did. Bumpy wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't some monster who hurt people for fun. He was a protector. He kept the chaos out. He kept the vultures from picking the neighborhood clean. He made sure the people who lived there, the working families, the honest shopkeepers, the grandmothers walking to church, could do so without fear. But that protection came with a price. And the price was this: you don't disrespect the man holding the line. So when Nate Cross walked the streets that Wednesday, people noticed. They saw him move through Harlem like a shadow with purpose. Calm, unhurried, unstoppable. He stopped at a few places, asked a few questions, never raised his voice, never showed impatience. He knew Vincent was still in the city, knew he hadn't run far. Men like Vincent never did. They thought proximity to their crew meant safety, thought numbers meant protection. They didn't understand that Nate Cross didn't avoid crowds. He walked right through them. By Wednesday evening, word came back to Bumpy. Nate had found him. Vincent was holed up in a warehouse in Brooklyn, surrounded by 6 of his crew. Armed, nervous, talking big to keep their courage up. Bumpy received the message while sitting in his apartment, reading the newspaper. He folded the paper, set it down, and looked at the man who'd delivered the news. When? Bumpy asked. Nate says tonight. Says it's time. Bumpy nodded once. Tell him to be clean. The man left. Bumpy poured himself a drink. Bourbon. Neat. He didn't toast. Didn't celebrate. He just sat in the quiet of his apartment and waited. Because that's what power looked like. Not the explosion. The certainty before it. And in Harlem, in every corner, every kitchen, every street, people felt it too. That tightening in the air. That knowledge that something inevitable was about to happen. Mothers pulled their children inside earlier than usual. Old men locked their doors and turned off their lights. The streets grew quieter as the sun set. Not out of fear, out of respect. Because Harlem knew. When Nate Cross moved, you didn't interfere. You didn't watch. You just let it happen. And you waited for the echo. The warehouse sat on the edge of Brooklyn, near the water where the city's noise faded into the low hum of industrial nothing. It was the kind of place people forgot about. Rusted metal, broken windows, shadows that swallowed sound. Vincent Cole thought it made him invisible. He was wrong. Inside, the air smelled like oil and old concrete. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak yellow light across crates and empty pallets. Vincent sat on a wooden chair in the center, surrounded by 6 men from his crew. They were armed, pistols tucked into waistbands. One had a shotgun leaning against the wall. They were talking loud, trying to convince themselves they were ready. Bumpy's old, one of them said, pacing. He ain't what he used to be. Another laughed, nervous energy spilling out. Yeah, and even if he sends someone, it's 6 against 1. We got this. Vincent didn't say much. He sat there, smoking a cigarette, trying to look calm. But his leg bounced. Just a little. Just enough. He'd been replaying it in his head all day. Walking into the rhythm club. Standing at Bumpy's table. Saying those words. Part of him felt proud. He'd made a statement. Showed Harlem that Bumpy Johnson wasn't untouchable. But another part, the part he wouldn't admit out loud, kept seeing the way Bumpy looked at him. No anger. No fear. Just certainty. And then that nod to Nate Cross. Vincent took another drag from his cigarette and told himself he was overreacting. Nate was just one man. One man couldn't walk into a warehouse with 6 armed guys and do anything, right? He was still convincing himself when the door opened. Not kicked in, not smashed, just opened. Quiet. Controlled. Nate Cross stepped inside. The room went still. He didn't rush. Didn't pull a gun. Didn't shout. He just stood there in the doorway, coat buttoned, one hand in his pocket, the other hanging loose at his side. His eyes swept the room. Took in every man. Every weapon. Every angle. Then they settled on Vincent. Vincent Cole, Nate said. His voice was calm. Almost polite. Vincent stood up slowly, trying to keep his hands steady. You got a lot of nerve walking in here alone. Nate didn't respond to that. He just started walking. Straight toward Vincent. Not fast. Not slow. Just inevitable. One of Vincent's crew stepped forward, hand moving toward his gun. That's far enough. Nate stopped. Looked at the man. Didn't say a word. Just looked. And the man's hand froze. Because something in Nate's eyes told him that if he pulled that gun, he wouldn't be fast enough. He wouldn't even be close. The man stepped back. Nate kept walking. Vincent's heart was pounding now. You think Bumpy scares me? You think I'm afraid of some old man's enforcer? Nate stopped about 6 feet away. Fear's got nothing to do with this. Then what? Vincent's voice cracked just slightly. What is this? A correction, Nate said. And then he moved. Not wild. Not frantic. With the precision of a man who'd done this before. His right hand came out of his pocket. The gun was already there. A .38 revolver, dark and simple. Vincent barely had time to register it before Nate raised it. Point blank. Wait, Vincent started. But Nate didn't wait. He pulled the trigger. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space. A crack that punched through the air and rattled off the metal walls. Vincent's body jerked backward, the chair toppling as he fell. The cigarette dropped from his hand, still burning. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. The 6 men stood frozen, hands halfway to their guns, eyes wide, mouths open. And Nate just stood there, gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. His expression hadn't changed. No rage, no satisfaction, just calm. He lowered the gun slowly, then turned his head to look at the other men in the room. Anyone else? He asked. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. No one answered. No one moved. Because they understood now. This wasn't a fight. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a message being delivered. And the message was already sent. Nate slipped the gun back into his coat pocket. Then he looked down at Vincent's body one last time. Not with pity. Not with cruelty. Just acknowledgement. This was what happened when you crossed the line. He turned and walked toward the door. His footsteps echoed in the silence. When he reached the threshold, he paused. Didn't turn around. Just spoke over his shoulder. Tell your people, Nate said. Harlem's not for sale. Then he stepped out into the night. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Inside the warehouse, the 6 men still hadn't moved. One of them finally exhaled, a shaky breath that sounded like surrender. Another knelt beside Vincent's body, hands trembling, not sure what to do. But they all understood. They'd come to Harlem thinking they could take it. Thinking reputation was just talk. Thinking Bumpy Johnson was just a name from another era. Now they knew better. Outside, Nate walked slowly back toward his car, parked 2 blocks away in the shadows. The night air was cold. Clean. He didn't hurry. Didn't look over his shoulder. He just walked. Because the job was done. Not with pleasure. Not with regret. With the same quiet certainty he'd carried into that warehouse. By the time he reached his car, the echo of that gunshot was already spreading. Not just through Brooklyn. Through every street, every corner, every whispered conversation in Harlem. The echo that said, some lines you don't cross. Some men you don't disrespect. and some consequences are absolute. Nate got into his car, started the engine, and drove back to Harlem. Back to report to Bumpy. Back to the only man who'd ever shown him that loyalty, respect, and power weren't about violence. They were about knowing exactly when violence was necessary, and never using it one moment sooner or later. By Thursday morning, the whole city knew. Vincent Cole was dead, shot in a Brooklyn warehouse. Point blank. One bullet. And the man who pulled the trigger walked out without a scratch. The police came, of course. They always did. They took photographs, drew chalk lines, interviewed the 6 men who'd been there. But those men didn't say much. Just shrugged. Said it happened fast. Said they didn't get a good look. The detectives didn't push. Because they knew. This wasn't their jurisdiction. Not really. This was Harlem business that happened to spill into Brooklyn. And Harlem business had its own rules, its own courts, its own justice. One detective, a man named Sullivan who'd been working the streets for 20 years, stood outside the warehouse smoking a cigarette. His partner, younger, more eager, came up beside him. "We could bring in Bumpy Johnson for questioning," the young detective said. "Everyone knows this came from him." Sullivan took a long drag, exhaled slowly. "You want to arrest Bumpy Johnson because some punk from Brooklyn got himself killed?" He ordered it. "Prove it." The young detective opened his mouth, then closed it. Sullivan flicked his cigarette away. Vincent Cole walked into Bumpy's club and disrespected him in front of everyone. What did he think was going to happen? A stern talking to. So we just let it go? Sullivan looked at him. "We document it. We filed a report. And we let Harlem be Harlem." He started walking back to the car. The young detective followed, frustrated. "That's not justice." Sullivan stopped. Turned. "Kid, there's the law. And then there's order. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes they ain't." Vincent Cole broke the order. And in Harlem, that's worse than breaking the law. He got in the car. The case was closed by Friday. But in Harlem, the echo was just beginning. At Tony's barber shop, the men who'd been waiting for this news received it with quiet nods. Earl sat in the chair getting a shave, eyes closed. "One shot." Tony worked the razor carefully. "That's what I heard. Clean. Nate don't do it any other way." Another man spoke up from the corner. "Brooklyn crew's already pulling back. Word is they're shutting down whatever they had planned for Harlem." Earl smiled slightly under the hot towel. "Smart. Because that's what the Echo did. It didn't just punish Vincent. It educated everyone else." At the diner on 125th, Dorothy and Lucille sat in their same spot. This time, their coffee was hot, and they were drinking it. "I heard he didn't even flinch," Dorothy said quietly. "Nate just walked in, did what he came to do, walked out." Lucille stirred her coffee. "That's the difference between Bumpy's people and everyone else. They don't make it personal. They make it professional. Doesn't that make it worse?" Lucille looked at her. "No, honey. It makes it final." Dorothy thought about that. "You think Vincent knew?" At the end, "I think he knew the moment Nate walked through that door." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Lucille added, softer, "I think he knew the moment he stood at Bumpy's table." And that was the real echo. Not just the gunshot. The understanding that came with it. You could challenge Bumpy Johnson. You could try to push into Harlem. You could talk big and act tough. But there were consequences. Real ones. Delivered by men who didn't need to prove anything because their reputation did it for them. By the weekend, something else started happening. People began showing up at Bumpy's businesses. Not to cause trouble. To pay respects. A bodega owner brought by a bottle of good scotch. "For Mr. Johnson," he said. "With gratitude." A woman who ran a numbers spot on the east side sent flowers with a simple card. "Thank you for keeping us safe." An older man who'd lived in Harlem for 40 years stopped by the Rhythm Club just to shake Bumpy's hand. "You did right," the old man said. "People can sleep now." Bumpy accepted it all with quiet grace. He didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. He just nodded. Thanked them. Reminded them that Harlem was theirs as much as his. Because that's what they didn't understand outside. Vincent's death wasn't about ego. It was about protection. It was about making sure that the people who lived in Harlem, the working families, the honest shopkeepers, the kids walking to school, didn't have to worry about outside crews coming in and turning their neighborhood into a war zone. Bumpy had drawn a line around Harlem years ago, and he maintained that line not with constant violence, but with the certainty that if you crossed it, there would be consequences. Swift, clean, final. That's what kept the peace. Not fear. Respect. On Sunday, Nate Cross went to church. He sat in the back pew at Abyssinian Baptist, same as he did every week. He listened to the sermon, sang the hymns, bowed his head during prayer. When the service ended, people greeted him, shook his hand, asked about his week. He smiled politely, said it was fine, asked about their families. No one mentioned Vincent Cole. No one had to. They knew what Nate had done. They knew why he'd done it. And they were grateful. Because men like Nate Cross were the reason their daughters could walk home at night without fear. The reason their sons didn't get recruited into violence. The reason Harlem remained Harlem, instead of becoming just another territory fought over by people who didn't care about the community. After church, Nate stopped by Bumpy's apartment. Bumpy was sitting by the window, reading the paper, jazz playing softly on the radio. He looked up when Nate entered. "It's done." "It's done," Nate said. Bumpy nodded. "Set the paper down." "Brooklyn." "Pulling back." "Won't be a problem." "Good." Bumpy stood, walked to the small bar, poured 2 glasses of bourbon. He handed one to Nate. They stood there in silence for a moment. Then Bumpy raised his glass slightly. "To order." Nate raised his. "To order." They drank. No celebration. No boasting. Just 2 men who understood that power wasn't about how loud you were. It was about how certain. Bumpy set his glass down. "You did right, Nate." Nate nodded. "I know." And he did. Because this wasn't about morality in the simple sense. It was about something more complex. The responsibility of power. The burden of maintaining peace through the willingness to break it when necessary. Vincent Cole had tried to tear down what Bumpy built. And Bumpy had responded the only way that made sense. Not with rage. With precision. The echo of that single gunshot would carry for years. It would reach young men thinking about trying their luck in Harlem. It would reach crews in other boroughs considering expansion. It would reach anyone who thought Bumpy Johnson's time was over. And it would tell them all the same thing. Harlem is protected. Harlem is respected. And if you can't respect it, you can't be part of it. That evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across Lenox Avenue, Harlem breathed easier. Not because of fear, because of certainty. The kind of certainty that comes when you know someone is holding the line. Someone who doesn't want war, but who will finish one if you bring it to his door. Vincent Cole had brought it, and Nate Cross had finished it. Now the echo settled into legend, into whispered stories told in barbershops and bars, into lessons passed from old men to young, into the fabric of Harlem itself. One shot, point blank, and everything that needed to be said was said. Years later, long after Vincent Cole's name faded from most conversations, the story remained. It lived in the spaces between words, in the pause before someone decided whether to challenge authority, in the quiet respect shown when Bumpy Johnson entered a room, in the way young men in Harlem learned what power actually meant. Not the loud kind, the certain kind. It was 1962 when a journalist from the New York Times came to Harlem trying to write a story about organized crime. He'd heard the legends, read the police reports, talked to detectives who spoke in careful, measured words about Bumpy Johnson. But he wanted more. He wanted to understand how one man could control an entire neighborhood without the constant violence that plagued other territories. He found his way to the Rhythm Club on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Bumpy was there, sitting in his usual booth, reading a book. Not the newspaper. A novel. James Baldwin. The journalist introduced himself. Asked if he could sit. Bumpy gestured to the seat across from him. "I'm writing about power structures in Harlem," the journalist said, pulling out a notepad. "How you've maintained control for so long." Bumpy closed his book, looked at the man. "Control is the wrong word. What would you call it?" "Stewardship." The journalist wrote that down. "Can you explain?" Bumpy leaned back. "This neighborhood doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the people who live here. The mothers, the kids, the shopkeepers. I just make sure nobody takes it from them." "And how do you do that?" Bumpy smiled slightly. "By making sure everyone understands the cost." The journalist hesitated, then asked, "Are you talking about Vincent Cole?" The room seemed to shift. Not dramatically, just subtly. A waiter nearby moved a little slower. A man at the bar turned slightly, listening. Bumpy's expression didn't change. "I'm talking about respect. Vincent Cole didn't respect this community. He thought he could come in here, talk however he wanted, take whatever he wanted. He was wrong. So you had him killed." Bumpy looked at the journalist for a long moment. "I didn't kill anyone, but I made sure the consequences of disrespect were clear. That's not violence. That's clarity." The journalist wrote quickly. Don't you think that's a dangerous precedent? Deciding who lives and dies. Bumpy leaned forward. You know what's dangerous? Chaos. When every crew thinks they can come into a neighborhood and set up shop. When working people can't walk home without worry. When kids can't play because bullets don't have names on them. That's dangerous. He paused. I prevent that. Not because I'm some kind of saint, but because I understand that power without responsibility is just destruction. And I'm not interested in destroying Harlem. I'm interested in protecting it. The journalist left that day with pages of notes. He wrote his article, tried to paint Bumpy as a complicated figure, part protector, part criminal. But he couldn't quite capture it, because the truth was more nuanced than any article could contain. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a villain. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who understood that the world operates on power, and that power could be used to create order or chaos. He chose order, and he enforced it with men like Nate Cross. Men who didn't enjoy violence, but understood its necessity. Men who could walk into a room and change everything with a single action. Men who carried the weight of their choices without complaint. By 1965, Nate was still by Bumpy's side. He'd aged, but not in the way most men do. His face had harder lines. His eyes carried more distance. But his hands remained steady. He still went to church every Sunday. Still spoke quietly. Still moved through Harlem with the same calm certainty he always had. People respected him, not just because of what he'd done, but because of how he carried it. He didn't brag, didn't relive old stories, didn't try to build a reputation beyond what his actions had already created. He was just Nate, and that was enough. One afternoon, a young man approached him outside a barber shop. Maybe 19, eager eyes, hungry. Mr. Cross, the young man said, I heard about you, about what you did for Mr. Johnson. I want to work. I want to be like you. Nate looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, No, you don't. The young man blinked. Sir, you think you want to be like me? Nate said quietly. But you don't know what that means. You see the respect, the reputation. You don't see the nights where you can't sleep because you remember every face, every decision, every moment where you had to choose between bad and worse. He stepped closer. I didn't become this because I wanted to. I became this because circumstances left me no choice. And once you step into this world, you don't step out. You carry it forever. The young man's confidence wavered. Nate softened slightly. You want to help your community? Go to school. Get a real job. Raise a family. Be the kind of man who builds instead of breaks. That's the real power. Not this. He walked away, leaving the young man standing there, thinking. That was Nate's legacy too. Not just the violence he'd committed, but the violence he'd prevented by showing young men there was another path. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson died. Heart attack. Sudden. Final. The entire neighborhood mourned. Thousands came to the funeral. Not because they were forced to, but because Bumpy had been more than a crime boss to them. He'd been a shield. A wall between Harlem and the forces that wanted to consume it. Nate stood at the funeral in a black suit, expressionless. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He just stood there, hands folded, watching as they lowered Bumpy into the ground. After the service, people came up to him. What happens now? They asked. Who takes over? Nate shook his head. Nobody takes over. That era is done. But Harlem will survive, Nate said. It always has. It doesn't need one man to protect it. It needs all of us. Every person who lives here. Every person who cares about it. That's the real lesson Bumpy taught. Power isn't about one person. It's about community. He walked away from the cemetery alone. And in the weeks that followed, Harlem did change. Not into chaos. Not into violence. But into something different. The old structures faded. New leaders emerged. Some good, some bad. But the echo of what Bumpy and Nate had built remained. That understanding that respect mattered. That consequences were real. That Harlem belonged to its people, and anyone who forgot that would learn quickly. Decades later, in barbershops and living rooms, the story is still told. About the night Vincent Cole walked into the rhythm club. About how Bumpy Johnson didn't raise his voice. About how Nate Cross walked into that warehouse. And about the single gunshot that echoed through Harlem and beyond. The details change depending on who's telling it. Some say there were 10 men in that warehouse. Some say 3. Some say Nate said something profound before he pulled the trigger. Some say he said nothing at all. But the core remains the same. A line was crossed. And there were consequences. Not because Bumpy was cruel, but because he understood that power without enforcement is just a suggestion, and suggestions don't protect communities. Certainty does. Nate Cross lived another 20 years after Bumpy died. He never worked for anyone else, never sought power for himself. He just lived quietly in Harlem, attending church, helping neighbors, existing as a reminder of what the neighborhood had been. When he passed in 1988, his funeral was smaller than Bumpy's. But the people who came were genuine. They told stories about the man who'd helped pay for their grandmother's medicine, the man who'd stopped a robbery at the corner store just by walking past, the man who'd taught their sons that strength wasn't about violence. It was about knowing when violence was necessary and having the discipline to use it sparingly. One old woman, probably in her 80s, stood at the service and spoke. Nathaniel Cross was a hard man, she said, but he was a good man. And in this world, sometimes you need hard men to do good things. She paused, her voice breaking slightly. He protected us, not because we asked, but because he believed we deserved it. And that's a kind of love that don't get talked about enough. The church was silent. Then someone began to clap, slowly at first. Then others joined. Not celebration, acknowledgement, of a man who'd carried the weight of terrible choices so others wouldn't have to. Of a man who'd walked into darkness so the community could live in light. Of a man who'd pulled a trigger at point-blank range and created an echo that still, decades later, reminded Harlem of what it meant to protect what you love. The echo doesn't shout anymore. It whispers. In the lessons passed down. In the respect still shown. In the understanding that power without principle is just violence. But power with purpose? That's legacy. And Vincent Cole's death, that single moment in a Brooklyn warehouse, became part of that legacy. Not as a warning, as a truth. Some lines don't get crossed. Some men don't get disrespected. And some echoes never fade. They just become part of the foundation. Part of what makes Harlem, Harlem. And long after Bumpy and Nate are gone, that echo remains. Quiet, certain, eternal.